Hi. For the past 3 years, I was involved in the Ukrainian conflict. I was, as a consultant, part of major-level decision-making process. I was involved in planning and execution of multiple operations. And today, I want to talk about why we lost this war and why I think NATO and the West are currently incapable of winning any major military conflicts at all. To give you some background, our opponents, the Russian military was and is absolutely thoroughly incompetent. Aside from Wagner forces, we never saw any evidence of Russian forces being capable of learning from their mistakes, adjusting their behavior. There was no adaptability. Instead, they repeated day after day exactly the same strategies, exactly the same operations, irrespective of their success, irrespective of their casualties. And failure to learn is something that is associated with incompetence. Unfortunately, we lost to this opponent, and it's important to understand why, because I don't see any relevant analysis in the Western media or professional circles. So the number one contributing factor was we never had a winning strategy. And some people will say, well, probably you did not see it, it was a top secret. But basically, on the brigade command level, your decision making was very simple. You need to find a place, a village, whatever, which is not well defended by Russians and which is big enough to get into papers. You take this village, you generate media buzz, and based on this media buzz, Zelensky office is going to give you medals, is going to give you promotions, is going to give you resources. If you don't generate media buzz, if you don't get into New York Times, Washington Post, then it means you do not do your part, you do not fight well, and you're going to be deprioritized. And that's how Ukrainian intelligence operated, that's how Ukrainian military operated. And we constantly had battles where we would take something that would have absolutely no military value, and then we would have to hold this against all costs, against all reason, because otherwise this would be surrendering something that already got into newspapers. Frankly, with this kind of attitude, we should have been defeated in 2022, but thankfully Russians used exactly the same decision-making process. So every time we would take a village on their side, they would try to take another village, a bigger one from our side, somewhere else, or they would try to retake the village they lost. They never thought about whether this makes sense. They never had the kind of a long-term military strategy or what they're trying to achieve. It was always very reactive, very media-dependent behavior, the same kind of behavior that we had. Unfortunately, it was not just a Ukrainian problem. It was really coming from the West. The West was behaving absolutely the same way. The West never had a plan. The West never had a single person who would be responsible for developing a strategy for this war. Instead, the West had many prime ministers, presidents. There are, as you can imagine, very, very many of such people in Europe. Each of them would offer Ukraine something independently, and then they would come together and try to coordinate this effort, to coordinate what they're giving Ukraine, without ever asking themselves, okay, where we want to be in a year from now, and what kind of equipment we need to achieve it, what kind of training we need to achieve it. There was just never any notion of this. It turned out to be not the worst, because as I was getting accustomed to the advice offered by American and British officers in particular, I was learning that this advice is basically destructive. The problem was that very few officers that were critical of Ukrainian military, that were saying, you need to change this, you need to change that, these officers were few to begin with, and they would earn very negative marks and very negative feedback from Ukrainians, and they would be taken off the case almost immediately. So the guys that remained were frankly, people of very questionable intelligence and behavior, like Mr. Ben Hodges, who was basically the best representation of this problem. And these people, they constantly spoke the same thing over and over again, that Ukrainians are the best soldiers they ever saw, that Ukrainians are the smartest, the hardest working, the most inventive, the most adaptable fighting force in the world. That's it, and it was very much loved by Ukrainians. Ukrainians were requesting this kind of advisors to come in and help them over and over, despite the fact that these advisors essentially were not contributing anything except convincing Ukrainians that in 3 months they are going to be in Moscow. In 3 months we are going to be in Moscow. That was the belief of majority of decision makers in Ukraine until late 2024. And that's not an overstatement. And this kind of belief was fostered by the Western advice and by the Western evaluation. Overall, I would characterize Western officers, unlike Western enlisted men who turned out predictably to be high-level professionals, very cool-headed, very sincere in their efforts. Western officers turned out to be people who excelled in only one thing, figuring out what their leaders, what their superiors want, and then saying this with a great dedication, with a great charisma, lots of military theater, like chopping the air, like, telling the truth as warriors should. In reality, they had no ability to understand strategic planning, they had no desire to learn, and most importantly, they had no fighting spirit. And that was a major problem of this war, is that in the modern society we teach people that they shouldn't fight, that death is horrible and life is the most sacred, and only fools fight in wars, and there is absolutely nothing in this world to die for. And then predictably, when a large conflict happens, we simply cannot find people who are quality people, who are smart, who are hardworking, who are capable, who are willing to fight and die. And this is not Afghanistan, this is not Iraq, and American officers, British officers very, very often come in with the attitude that we are going to make some kind of a tacit agreement with Russians. We don't attack you, you don't attack us. And to their great surprise, it was not working. Russians were never interested in this kind of games. And these officers were not capable or not ready to fight any other type of war. They really, really were not warriors. They were just people in uniform collecting the salaries. This was especially evident in the sense that all of them were exceptionally afraid of Putin's assassins, to the point of being open about their fears, openly saying that, guys, if we are going to beat Russians at the front, they're going to send people with Novichok and kill my family. You are insane. You are crazy. You are these shitty guys who want to fight and kill. Why would you want to do that? No, the military is not about that. The military is about collecting pension. They were open about this. Again, these guys look charismatic. They look fit. They look very military-like, but they have no balls. Very often, we had to fight Russians on one front and West on the other front, because the Western officers were trying to constrain our operations, to constrain our capabilities, hoping that this constriction will earn them something from the Russians, will earn them something, some recognition, some kind of agreement with the Russians. That's not a joke. Again, people who made agreements in Afghanistan and survived by doing so were convinced that that's the way to live. The NATO was absolutely arrogant in its position that it has actually nothing to learn from this conflict. It was refusing to learn anything. I'll give you one point. Every brigade which was trained completely in the West turned out to be substandard. And there were two reasons. One was selection bias. Essentially, people who wanted to fight, they would just go to the front and fight and learn there. And people who didn't want to fight, they wanted to go to Europe and spend there 1 month, 3 months, 6 months learning. And then hopefully they would give another bribe and avoid fighting altogether. So these brigades indeed had substandard personnel. While another problem was that they were told to fight in accordance to military manuals, and today's NATO military manuals are just as useless as Russian ones, because in this war, anything beyond 20, 30 people on the battlefield was just dying. If you were moving a whole battalion against the enemy, you would have tanks, you would have infantry. The enemy would detect it 20 kilometers away and would hit you with drones, would hit you with artillery. You would have 80% casualties in a single day. And that was actually the fate of many of these brigades. They would sustain colossal casualties in the first engagement. And at this point, they would become demoralized and incapable of offensive. Now, again, the NATO officers were completely refusing this reality. They did not want to understand what's happening on the front. They kept teaching our soldiers the same thing over and over and over again, irrespective of the consequences. The same thing goes for NATO and Western technology people. So it's not a big secret that majority of military technology that is used by Ukraine today, which is drones, which is the most important component of the Ukrainian military today, it's manufactured in China. And it's manufactured in a very close collaboration with actually Ukrainian military specialists, people who understand the drone warfare. Some of these people are stationed in China on a permanent basis. It's a very unpleasant truth that they do collaborate with Chinese military forces, with Chinese engineers. That's one of the reasons why China does not ban sales to Ukraine, does not try to take Russian side in this conflict, actually. It actually supplies more military hardware, semi-military hardware to Ukraine than it does to Russia, because it wants to learn. It wants to see what Ukrainians do, it wants to see what is effective, and it wants to change its military to fight the US, actually. And it's very committed to this effort. By comparison, the US has no interest what happens there. The US kept supplying switchblades that nobody wanted to use, javelins, which everyone clearly realized that drones worked better against tanks. The US was committed to military strategies and operations from 30 years ago, and every manner of discussion was always leading to the US guys telling us that, Ukrainians are just savages. They just don't know how to use our equipment. Great example, tanks. It's been a long discussion whether tanks need active armor. The Western position is no, they don't. We have this multi-layer passive armor, which is sufficient. And indeed, American, British, whatever Western passive armor, basic armor, is really superior to every single Soviet or Russian type of armor. It's indeed true. But the active armor is essential. And the reason is because if your tank is going to be hit by RPGs or by drones that use near identical explosives, you're not going to be knocked out. So you can say that from a design perspective, Western engineers are correct that the passive armor is sufficient to protect the tank against such threats. But what's going to happen is that some of your systems are going to be down, there's going to be a lot of damage, and it will be very hard to ascertain this damage when you are inside the vehicle, when you are in combat. And the decision that is going to be made, we are not in movies, we are not Brad Pitts, we're either turning back, or if we can't turn back, we're actually abandoning the vehicle. And that's what's going to happen, and having active armor helps a lot to limit the damage. And the crew actually realizes, yes, we were hit, but nothing bad happened. 90% of things are functional, so we can continue with the mission. And that's a big difference. Again, the Western specialists we worked with did not want to acknowledge this. The Western specialists had a religious belief that every single problem we have can be fixed by F-35, and therefore this war should not be seriously considered in terms of experience, in terms of learning, because F-35 was not used. They literally believed that F-35 should be used to hit every single target, and that's going to solve the conflict. What they didn't realize is that if you use F-35 to do everything, then you need $10 trillion, and you need to outspend your opponent about 10,000 to 1. Because F-35 is an exceptionally expensive piece of equipment. And by the way, the reason we use drones, and the reason we use only drones, and the reason why we rely on drones is not only because they work, but it's also because they're cheap. For example, attack helicopters. Okay, we use them because we have them, but we realize that 100 drones will do basically the same job, and they do it better, and they do it much cheaper. Again, this kind of learning was not incorporated because on the West there was a lot of commitment to the existing interests of major arms suppliers. There were a lot of generals working for these suppliers who were saying time and time over that every learning from this war is just garbage. We should not trust it. We should not learn from it. F-35, exceptionally expensive military hardware, is the only way going forward. Even the drone development in the West, it was very clear that it is very strange that these are $10 million piece drones that are fully autonomous, that are deployable, that are fireable, that are swarm, that are this, that are that, and with zero learning or incorporation of what kind of drone tactics is actually efficient on the modern battlefield. Chinese were interested in this. Americans were arrogant and dismissive. I apologize for very strong words that I used throughout this presentation, and unfortunately I just wanted to say that if we don't learn from this conflict, the next conflict, which can be against China, which can be in Taiwan, which can be in some other location, is going to cost us exceptionally much. We will sustain casualties, and we are going to be defeated because our military is sharp, is charismatic, it's soldierly looking, but I'm sorry to say this, aside from American enlisted men, it is incompetent and it is incapable. And what's happened in Afghanistan, what's happened in Ukraine, will happen over and over again. Thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.